The 1990s marked a turning point in American justice. After decades of rising homicide rates that plagued the nation since the 1960s, the tide finally began to turn. Violent crime rates dropped, and for the first time in years, police departments, once overwhelmed by fresh cases, found the breathing room to reopen dusty old case files long abandoned in the shadows. Armed with cutting-edge forensic breakthroughs, including DNA analysis and growing digital databases, a new generation of detectives set out to solve the mysteries that time had almost forgotten. Among them stood one name above the rest: Detective L. Smith. A relentless veteran with an uncanny ability to turn dead ends into breakthroughs, Smith earned a legendary reputation. When other investigators hit a wall, it was Smith they called. In 1991, the quiet isolation of a remote property near Colorado Springs, Colorado, shattered with the chilling disappearance of 13-year-old Heather Church. A responsible young girl, the Tractons' only daughter among 4 siblings, Heather lived with her mother, Diane, as the family adjusted to life after a painful separation. Their home was up for sale, a symbol of change on the horizon. But on the 17th of September, 1991, their fragile sense of stability was destroyed when Heather vanished without a trace. The search was massive. Helicopters scanned the wilderness, tracking dogs combed the woods, and investigators interviewed hundreds of neighbors. Media coverage exploded, turning Heather's disappearance into a statewide obsession. Yet despite all the noise, the close-knit community seemed to yield no answers. For years, the case remained an open wound until a horrifying discovery reignited the hunt for justice. Deep in a desolate area, searchers found Heather Church's skull. What had once been a missing persons case now became a murder investigation. Desperate for answers, local authorities turned to the only man they believed could crack the mystery: L. Smith. But what Smith uncovered in the darkness of Colorado Springs would plunge the town and the entire state into a far deeper nightmare. Secrets long buried began to surface, painting a terrifying picture of a predator who had evaded justice for far too long. Hello, I'm Brian Nemendorfer, and welcome to another episode of Lost Bones. Today we follow the relentless pursuit of truth through the eyes of Detective L. Smith and examine how the murder of Heather Church and the unsolved killings across Colorado and beyond reshaped the way America investigates cold cases. As we'll discover, Heather's murder wasn't an isolated tragedy. Authorities later linked her disappearance to a chilling string of unsolved cases stretching back more than a decade, including the mysterious vanishing of 16-year-old Catherine Jean Hayes in 1980. Catherine disappeared from the parking lot of Uncle Albert's chicken stand in rural Louisiana. Her case, at the time, barely registering with the public or the media. Months passed with no answers. Then, just before Halloween, a hunter stumbled upon a skull floating in the Little Nantashi Creek near the quiet town of St. Maurice. Forensic testing confirmed the worst. It was Catherine. These forgotten cases, once thought to be isolated tragedies, began to form a sinister mosaic, one that Detective L. Smith would stop at nothing to complete. The disappearance of the young woman was officially treated as a homicide from the start. Yet, despite the urgency of the investigation, no meaningful progress was made in the years that followed. Eventually, the case was shelved, gathering dust like so many others before it. But in 1983, the calm of the region was shattered once again. This time, it was the vanishing of 26-year-old Faye Allen Self that sent shockwaves through the small Louisiana town. On the night of the 30th of March, Faye left her infant daughter in the care of her mother and drove off in her car, heading toward a local roadside bar and restaurant wagon wheel along Highway 1 in the town of Armstead. There, she met with a friend and 2 acquaintances for what was supposed to be a casual dinner. The evening unfolded quietly until Faye suddenly told her companion she needed to leave. She explained that she had to pick up her daughter and wake up early the next day. That was the last time anyone would ever see Faye Allen Self alive. The following morning, Faye's mother grew worried when her daughter failed to return for her baby. Alarmed, the family filed a missing person report with the local authorities. What happened next only deepened the mystery. Police found Faye's car still parked outside the Broquet Wagon Wheel restaurant. Curiously, the vehicle was locked on all sides. But it was what they found inside that disturbed investigators most. On the back seat sat a pair of brand new shoes Faye had been wearing the night before. That single detail sparked grim speculation. Had Faye been abducted before she even made it to her car? Despite an extensive investigation of the area in the days that followed, no trace of Faye was ever found. The case grew cold. Then, just 2 months later, an unexpected horror unfolded. In late May, a young man named Sonny Higgs frantically contacted police after discovering the lifeless body of his girlfriend, 20-year-old Vanda Faye Hodson, in their shared apartment. Vanda, a cashier at a local grocery store, lived in the Rivertown apartment complex, a place that would soon become infamous. The crime scene was nothing short of brutal. Vanda's body bore nearly 30 stab wounds and signs of savage beating with what forensic experts later identified as a screwdriver. Autopsy. Results confirmed evidence of sexual assault. But perhaps the most chilling connection was this. Rivertown was the very same complex where Faye Allen Self had lived. To authorities, this seemed like a cruel coincidence. After all, Faye and Vanda didn't appear to know one another, and no clear link between their cases could be established. Yet the brutality of Vanda's murder shook the small community to its core. Locals rallied, raising nearly $4,000 in reward money for information leading to an arrest. But as with Faye's case, the investigation soon stalled and faded from public attention. Nearly a year later, headlines across the nation screamed of another gruesome discovery. Along the side of Highway 59 near Houston, Texas, authorities found the dismembered remains of a young woman. The victim had been decapitated, her legs severed, and her torso stabbed over 25 times, including multiple wounds to the genital area. The brutality didn't end there. Examinations revealed further evidence of manual strangulation and severe blunt force trauma. After a public plea for help, the body was identified as 17-year-old Nydia Mendona, a local strip club dancer who had vanished days before. But no witnesses came forward, and her final hours remained a haunting mystery. As investigators struggled to make sense of the carnage, another body surfaced, this time in the rural town of Flatonia, Texas. The victim, 22-year-old Melody Ann Bush. She too had disappeared shortly before her body was found stuffed inside a drainage culvert. While her corpse bore stab wounds like the others, the official cause of death shocked even the most seasoned pathologists: acute acetone poisoning. Melody's murder, like those before it, was savage, bizarre, and shrouded in unanswered questions. Authorities tried to reconstruct her final hours but found no leads, no suspects, no clear motive. And so, one by one, these cases slipped into obscurity, isolated tragedies connected only by their brutality and the silence that followed. In the years that followed, none of these cases saw any meaningful progress. No connections were drawn between the crimes, and no comparisons were made. Each case was treated as an isolated act of brutal violence, seemingly random and unconnected. With few exceptions, the victims fit a tragically familiar profile: young women living on the margins of society, many without close family or friends to quickly raise the alarm when they vanished. Sadly, this pattern was far from uncommon. Across the United States, hundreds of violent homicides each year fit this grim mold, and these cases often slipped quietly beneath the surface of public and law enforcement attention. It wasn't until 3 years later that new cases began to emerge, this time in Springs, Colorado. The first was the disappearance of 15-year-old Rossi Sperry. At the time, Rossi was married to Joseph Sperry, a soldier stationed at Fort Carson. Joseph had traveled to Florida to visit his daughter from a previous relationship, taking along their 3-month-old baby. Despite the distance, Rossi and Joseph remained in daily contact by phone. On the 10th of November, 1987, Rossi called Joseph, telling him she loved him and had a surprise waiting for him when he returned. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But later that day, when Joseph tried to call his wife back, no one answered. Over the next several days, his repeated calls went unanswered. Though unusual, Joseph initially chose not to panic, deciding instead to enjoy the remaining 4 days of his trip. He believed Rossi would meet him at the airport upon his return, as they had planned. But the reunion never happened. When Joseph landed back in Colorado Springs, Rossi was nowhere to be found. Alarmed, he rushed to the local police department and filed a missing person report. At first, investigators floated the theory that Rossi had left voluntarily, perhaps fleeing an unhappy marriage. This idea gained traction when officers learned that Rossi's car and the couple's newly purchased television were also missing. Joseph fiercely rejected this theory, insisting his wife would never abandon him or their baby. He also told investigators about something far more troubling. When he returned to their apartment, he found broken glass, what appeared to be bloodstains inside. Forensic teams examined the scene. Interestingly, all of Rossi's personal belongings, her clothes, shoes, and jewelry, were still in the apartment. But despite the broken glass and traces of blood, investigators struggled to rule out the possibility that Rossi had simply run away. Perhaps, they reasoned, she had left her belongings behind to start fresh elsewhere. As time passed and no sign of Rossi emerged, police began to reconsider their original theory. Their focus soon turned toward Joseph himself. With no concrete evidence of Rossi's whereabouts before his return from Florida, Joseph suddenly found himself the prime suspect. His life quickly unraveled under the weight of constant scrutiny from both the police and the local media. That pressure only began to ease when a new clue surfaced. Rossi's car was finally located, abandoned in a parking lot north of their home. The vehicle was locked, and a locksmith was called to open the doors. Inside, investigators found smudges of grease on the driver's seat. Joseph immediately noticed something else. The odometer reading showed that the car had traveled roughly 500 kilometers since Rossi last used it. Even more troubling was the absence of a brown suitcase that Rossi always kept in the trunk. With this discovery, investigators finally began to entertain a darker possibility. Rossi Sperry hadn't run away. She had been taken. Despite ramping up their efforts, no further leads materialized in the following months. Frustrated by the lack of answers, Joseph took matters into his own hands, launching his own investigation into his wife's disappearance. What he would uncover next would lead him down a dangerous path, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about Rossi's fate. Joseph's first theory was that Rossi might have been abducted by a pimp and forced into prostitution. Clinging to this idea, he began visiting known red light districts, wandering the streets late into the night in search of a glimpse of his wife, or a whisper of her whereabouts. But his desperate search turned up nothing. No trace of Rossi, no clue to confirm his fears. Day by day, Joseph's hope began to fade. The weight of uncertainty crushed him, and slowly, his life spiraled out of control. Depression consumed him, and soon he found himself unable to care for his infant daughter. Eventually, he lost custody of the child and fell into the grip of héroïne addiction. Meanwhile, the authorities continued to regard Joseph with suspicion. His name remained on the list of primary suspects in his wife's disappearance. In the end, the case of Rossi Sperry became yet another unsolved mystery, filed away and forgotten in the cold case archives. But in 1991, another disappearance would rock the Colorado Springs community, a tragedy that bore eerie similarities to Rossi's case. On the evening of the 17th of September, 13-year-old Heather Dawn Church was left home alone in what should have been a safe and quiet house. Her mother, Diane, had dropped off the younger children at a local Mormon church for a scout meeting, trusting Heather to look after her 5-year-old brother. That night, around 8:30 p.m., Diane, managing the responsibilities of a single mother, called home to check on her children. Heather answered, and Diane reminded her to close the master bedroom window, which she'd noticed open before leaving. Heather assured her she would take care of it. But when Diane returned later that night with the younger kids, something felt wrong immediately. The house was dark, unnaturally quiet. Calling out for Heather, Diane's voice echoed unanswered through the empty rooms. Panic set in. She searched every corner of the home, but Heather was nowhere to be found. Frantic, Diane began calling neighbors, friends, and even her ex-husband, Mike Church, desperate to find someone who might know where Heather had gone. But no one had seen or heard from the girl. Finally, in the depths of the night, she contacted the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. A deputy arrived swiftly to document the initial report. By dawn, a search and rescue team was mobilized. Throughout the next day, the neighborhood and nearby forests were combed inch by inch. Meanwhile, investigators examined the home itself and made a disturbing discovery. The very window Diane had warned Heather about showed clear signs of forced entry. Forensic specialists dusted the area for prints and found a set of fingerprints that didn't match. The prints were sent to the FBI for analysis, but the results were inconclusive. No matches were found in any federal criminal database, suggesting that whoever had entered the home had no prior record or had managed to stay out of law enforcement's reach. And in the late 1980s and early 1990s, fingerprint identification was a slow, painstaking process. Databases were limited, and the chances of finding a match in a case like Heather's were slim. As the weeks turned to months, no breakthroughs emerged. Despite widespread media coverage, no concrete leads surfaced. Then, 2 years later, a chilling discovery was made. A local man, a scrap metal collector and part-time camper, was walking along the Hart Range road when he spotted something unusual in a ravine. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was human remains. Police were called to the scene and recovered a well-preserved human skull. Dental analysis quickly confirmed the worst. The remains belonged to Heather Dawn Church. After 2 long years of agony and uncertainty, the fate of the young girl was finally revealed, but the identity of her killer remained shrouded in darkness. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the skull. The discovery of Heather's remains brought renewed public attention to the case, amplifying the pressure on authorities to deliver answers. But despite the mounting media scrutiny, no meaningful progress was made. 2 more years would pass in frustrating silence. It wasn't until 1993 that a spark of determination reignited the investigation. Newly elected El Paso County Sheriff John Anderson decided it was time for a fresh approach. Anderson, who had once trained under a legendary investigator named L.W. Smith, believed there was only one person capable of untangling the mystery that had haunted Colorado Springs for too long. Smith, a seasoned detective and captain of the county's detective force, was known not only for his relentless pursuit of justice, but also for his rare ability to let the evidence speak for itself. He had no interest in forcing facts to fit a theory. Instead, he let the truth guide his investigation wherever it led. When Sheriff Anderson presented the cold, forgotten file of Heather Dawn Church to Smith, he promised the veteran investigator full freedom to lead the case as he saw fit. By that point in his career, L.W. Smith wasn't just another detective. He was perhaps the finest investigator Colorado had ever known. What no one could have predicted was that this would mark the birth of Colorado Springs' very first cold case unit. The investigation into Heather Church's murder was no longer just another statistic. It had become a priority, a violent homicide worthy of the determination and focus needed to finally uncover the truth. But who exactly was the man tasked with unraveling this dark mystery? Before rising to become Colorado's most respected detective, L.W. Smith had faced his own trials, both personal and professional, that shaped his remarkable instincts and unwavering resolve. In his early years, Smith had tried his hand at entrepreneurship, launching several small businesses. Yet every venture ended in failure. At a crossroads in his life and desperate for direction, Smith turned to prayer, asking God for guidance. Not long after, an unexpected answer arrived. A cousin who worked for the Colorado Springs Police Department suggested Smith apply for a position on the force. Convinced this was his divine calling, Smith submitted his application and began the rigorous entry process. But there was a problem. During the physical exam, Smith was told he was a few centimeters too short to meet the department's minimum height requirement. Crushed but not defeated, Smith confided in his cousin, who proposed a solution as unorthodox as it was absurd. Take a blow to the head with a baton to cause slight swelling enough to meet the height threshold. Desperate to follow what he believed was his purpose, Smith agreed. The next day, still bearing the swelling from the blow, he retook the height measurement. It worked. Smith cleared the minimum requirement and was officially accepted into the Colorado Springs Police Department. It was the kind of origin story that would follow him for the rest of his career. In his early years on the force, Smith worked a variety of cases but initially played a supporting role, never leading an investigation himself. That changed in 1975 when he was handed his first major case, a murder investigation that would launch his career. On the 1st of July 1975, 4 armed men attempted to rob a Red Lobster restaurant on South Academy Boulevard in Colorado Springs. The robbery failed, and the suspects fled empty-handed. But as they made their getaway, they encountered Karen Grammer, an 18-year-old waitress waiting outside for her boyfriend to pick her up. Fearing she could identify them, the men abducted Karen and took her with them as they fled. Shortly after, the suspects robbed a small convenience store, this time successfully stealing cash. Authorities quickly connected the two crimes and launched a full-scale manhunt for the suspects. What they didn't know was that somewhere in the chaos, Karen Grammer remained in the captor's hands, her fate hanging by a thread. Karen, having only recently moved to Colorado Springs, lived alone. Her absence went unnoticed at first. It wasn't until her roommate grew concerned that anyone realized she was missing. For nearly a week, Karen's whereabouts remained a terrifying mystery, and so began L.W. Smith's first true trial as a detective, a case that would test the very instincts and perseverance that would later define his career. Authorities from a neighboring jurisdiction soon contacted the Colorado Springs police with grim news. The body of a young woman, an employee of the same restaurant targeted in the robbery, had been found. According to initial reports, Karen Grammer had been discovered gravely injured on the back porch of a nearby home. Sadly, the residents of the house were away at the time, and Karen, unable to survive her wounds, died alone at the doorstep. Blood, stains, and partial fingerprints were later recovered near the doorbell, where she had likely tried to call for help. Although Karen had died the same night she was abducted, her identity remained a mystery for nearly a week. It wasn't until her roommate filed an official missing person report that investigators connected the dots. The roommate also became the person tasked with the heartbreaking duty of identifying Karen's body. Detective L.W. Smith and his team were assigned to lead the investigation into Karen's abduction and murder. What followed was nearly a year of painstaking work before any solid leads finally surfaced. Eventually, two key suspects emerged as the ringleaders of the violent gang: 18-year-old Fred Glenn, a civilian employee, and Michael Corbett, a soldier stationed at a nearby base. When Fred Glenn was brought in for questioning, he showed little hesitation. He confessed in full, providing chilling details about the botched robberies and the murder spree the group had carried out. The killing spree, as Fred revealed, had started a month prior to the Red Lobster incident. The Free Haven first victim was 29-year-old Daniel Van Loan, a cook. Initially, the group intended only to rob Daniel, but they ended up driving him to a secluded location. There, they forced him to lie, face down on the ground, before executing him with a single gunshot to the head. The reward for this senseless murder? 50 cents. Days later, the group committed yet another killing, this time with the involvement of 19-year-old Winfred Prophet, a fellow soldier looking to buy marijuana. In a sudden escalation of violence, Michael Corbett, recently trained in bayonet combat, stabbed Prophet to death using his newly acquired skills. Finally came the brutal murder of Karen Grammer. According to Fred's confession, after the convenience store robbery, the men took Karen back to their shared apartment. At first, they claimed they intended to release her, but what followed was hours of unspeakable sexual violence. Eventually, they decided to dispose of her. With a cloth covering her face, they drove Karen to a nearby park. Fred, high on LSD at the time, claimed he made the decision to stab Karen repeatedly, ending her life in the darkness of the city's outskirts. Because of Fred Glenn's full confession, both he and Michael Corbett were swiftly convicted of the murders of Daniel Van Loan, Winfred Prophet, and Karen Grammer. During sentencing, Judge Hunter Hardiman described the crimes as acts of pure brutality, declaring there was no logical reason or clear motive behind the murders. Fred Glenn was initially sentenced to death by gas chamber. However, 2 years later, the Colorado Supreme Court overturned the state's death penalty statute, converting his sentence into 3 consecutive life terms with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Over the years, Fred Glenn would request parole multiple times. Each attempt met with fierce opposition, largely thanks to the tireless efforts of Karen's brother, Kelsey Grammer, the acclaimed Hollywood actor. Kelsey became a vocal advocate for justice, campaigning relentlessly to keep Fred Glenn behind bars. During parole hearings, Kelsey spoke of the deep loss his family suffered. He described Karen as a bright, kind-hearted young woman who had just graduated high school and moved to Colorado Springs for love. He recalled her passion for writing poetry and her dreams for the future dreams stolen in a single night of cruelty. Though Fred Glenn expressed remorse for his crimes and apologized to the family, Kelsey maintained that no apology could erase the pain of his sister's murder. He argued that while forgiveness was possible, freedom for Fred was not. To this day, Fred Glenn remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence. His accomplice, Michael Corbett, remained behind bars until his death from natural causes in 2019. The murder of Karen Grammer left a lasting scar on the Colorado Springs community and on Detective L.W. Smith, who had witnessed firsthand the cruelty humans could inflict upon the innocent. For years, L.W. Smith's career had faded quietly into the background until the disappearance of Heather Dawn Church thrust his name back into the spotlight. During the initial search for the missing teenager, Smith had played no active role. But years later, when Heather's remains were finally discovered, local authorities knew there was only one man to call. Smith, renowned for his sharp investigative mind, was asked to lead the revived investigation. Given full authority over the case, Smith wasted no time. He meticulously reconstructed the, quote, timeline of Heather's disappearance and murder, re-examining every shred of evidence and every overlooked clue from the original investigation. He knocked on doors, interviewing nearly every neighbor near the Church family home. He even reviewed minor crimes committed in the area at the time, searching for overlooked patterns or connections. No detail was too small, no alibi too insignificant to escape his scrutiny. The work was slow, methodical, and exhausting. Exactly the kind of challenge that suited a detective like L.W. Smith. In collaboration with forensic specialists at the County Crime Lab, Smith proposed an innovative idea: isolate one of the latent fingerprints collected at the crime scene and submit it for new analysis. Smith believed that tracking the source of that single print could reveal the killer, perhaps someone with a criminal history in another state. With this in mind, Smith ordered the print to be sent to more than 50 jurisdictions, eventually nearing 100. After roughly 2 months of waiting, a breakthrough finally arrived. From Sayes, Louisiana. The fingerprint recovered from the Church home matched that of a man previously convicted of vehicle theft. The suspect was identified as Robert Charles Browne, a resident of Colorado Springs. Smith immediately recognized something strange. Robert Browne's name had been on the original list of individuals police intended to interview, but they had never successfully reached him. Even more unsettling, Browne lived less than a kilometer from the Church family's home. Officers soon located Browne and brought him in for questioning. Calm and composed, Browne denied any involvement in Heather's murder. When Smith asked if Browne had ever performed maintenance or repair work at the Church residence, the suspect firmly denied having any connection to the property. But when Smith revealed that Browne's fingerprint had been found on the window of Heather's bedroom, Browne did something unexpected. He calmly requested that his fingerprints be taken again for confirmation. The quiet confidence of his response was both unsettling and perplexing. Despite Browne's apparent self-assurance, the results came back the same. The fingerprint from the crime scene was his. There was no doubt. Still, Browne maintained his innocence. Smith and his team faced a dilemma. While the fingerprint evidence was damning, they feared it might not be enough to secure a conviction in court. Then, in a surprising turn, 2 months later, Robert Browne changed his story. Under pressure from the district attorney's office, Browne agreed to confess to the murder of Heather Dawn Church. His change of heart came largely due to the efforts of District Attorney John Anderson, who personally met with Browne to negotiate a plea deal. In exchange for his confession, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty and dropped additional charges connected to the case. In his confession, Browne explained that he had entered the Church home through the bounce formation window. Once inside, he unexpectedly encountered Heather. In his own words, he panicked and attacked the girl, strangling her in the process. Unsure of what to do next, Browne carried her body to a remote area and abandoned her remains. With Browne's confession in hand, the court formally sentenced him to life in prison in March of 1995, officially closing the case of Heather Dawn Church's murder at least on the surface. But for L.W. Smith, this was only the beginning. What lay ahead would reveal Robert Charles Browne to be far more dangerous and far more prolific than anyone could have imagined. The conviction of Robert Charles Browne in the Heather Dawn Church case brought what many believed was a satisfying conclusion. But for Detective L.W. Smith, something about Browne's confession didn't sit right. With his years of experience, Smith suspected that Browne had taken the plea deal not out of guilt alone, but because his defense attorneys warned him of something far more threatening: the possibility that investigators were quietly re-examining other unsolved cases, any one of which could further incriminate him in a broader, more damning trial. By pleading guilty to Heather's murder, Browne effectively limited the legal scope of the Browne investigation. Many of the other cold cases, especially those outside Smith's jurisdiction, now had little justification for further pursuit, at least for the time being. But not long after his conviction, Robert Charles Browne would shock everyone yet again, embarking on a chilling series of confessions that revealed a trail of violence stretching far beyond what anyone had imagined. Like many violent offenders, Robert Charles Browne's story began in a broken home. Born in rural Louisiana during the 1950s, Browne was raised in a family riddled with instability and mental illness. His father, Ronald Browne, served as a deputy sheriff for Red River Parish, but the family's reputation in the community concealed deeper struggles. On his mother Buela's side, a long history of severe depression and family trauma cast a dark shadow over Robert's childhood. His grandfather, for example, had been found dead drowned in a cistern with a heavy chain wrapped around his neck in what authorities ruled an apparent suicide. Despite this tragic family history, neighbors described the Browne family as respectable and decent people. As a child, Robert was seen as something of a prodigy. He excelled in mathematics, earning praise for his natural ability with numbers. But even then, those who knew him best noticed his solitary nature and unpredictable, explosive temper. Before completing high school, Robert abruptly dropped out and enlisted in the U.S. Army. At just 17 years old, he was deployed to Vietnam and later stationed in South Korea. Little is known about his military service, but records indicate that his discharge came after repeated drug-related offenses. Rather than return home to Louisiana after leaving the Army, Browne drifted across the American South, living intermittently in Louisiana, Texas, and Colorado. He worked a string of low-paying jobs as a clerk, a handyman, and even a flower delivery driver. During his adult life, Browne married at least 5 times, with each marriage ending in divorce. Investigators later noted a chilling detail. All of his former wives shared similar physical characteristics. They were petite, thin, and appeared fragile traits that may have fit the profile of his ideal victim. During his second marriage to a Vietnamese woman, Robert fathered a son named Thomas. When detectives eventually interviewed Browne's 3 most recent ex-wives, they all described him as physically abusive and dangerously volatile. His 5th wife even recalled an incident in which Robert, in a fit of rage, declared that he hated women and hated police officers just as much. By 1981, Browne's criminal record had begun to grow. His first recorded arrest was for car theft in Louisiana. Not long after, a warrant was issued for his arrest in connection with the bizarre theft of a church bell. 5 years later, he was convicted again, this time for stealing a pickup truck. Additional arrests followed, including charges for drug possession, arson, and, quote, animal cruelty acts described in police reports as involving extreme brutality. Robert Charles Browne fit nearly every profile of a violent offender, and yet, for years, he remained largely off the radar. After his arrest for Heather Church's murder, Browne maintained his silence, but by the early 2000s, he began to talk. His first confession involved the murder of a soldier's wife. According to Browne, he stole a distinctive ring from his victim, a small but telling clue. This detail brought investigators back to a long-forgotten case: the disappearance of Rosie Sperry, the 15-year-old wife of Army soldier Joseph Sperry. Joseph had always insisted that Rosie wore a unique ring, and Browne's description of it matched perfectly. Further investigation uncovered another disturbing fact. At the time of Rosie's disappearance, Browne worked as a handyman in the very apartment complex where Rossi lived. In his chilling confession, Browne admitted to breaking into Rossi's apartment, sexually assaulting her, and then murdering her. He claimed to have dismembered the girl's body, scattering her remains in a remote area far from the city. Browne even provided specific details about where he claimed to have disposed of the body. But despite extensive searches of the area he described, investigators were never able to locate Rossi's remains. Still, the details of his confession were too precise and too consistent with what investigators already knew to dismiss. Robert Charles Browne was sentenced to a second life term for the murder of Rossi Sperry. But it wasn't long before Browne stunned the authorities again. While behind bars, he began sending a series of cryptic, taunting letters to the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. In one message, Browne wrote that the score was 1 for the authorities and 48 for the other team, referring to himself. To Detective L.W. Smith, the tone was eerily familiar, reminiscent of the Zodiac Killer's infamous letters decades earlier. At first, Smith remained skeptical. He wondered if Browne was simply playing mind games, seeking attention from behind bars. Initially, prosecutors limited how deeply investigators could pursue these letters. But soon, the pattern became impossible to ignore. As the letters continued, detectives from jurisdictions across the country began re-examining their cold cases. The horrifying possibility emerged that Browne might be telling the truth, that he was confessing to 48 or 49 murders committed since 1970. According to Browne, his first victim was a fellow soldier, killed during a drunken brawl over a woman in South Korea in 1970. Browne's confessions were strange, sometimes poetic. He described certain murders in the Matto form of short stories, riddles, and fragmented prose. Yet, many of the details matched real cases long since forgotten in the files of small-town police departments. Among the murders Browne claimed was the killing of 21-year-old Lisa Mary Lowe in 1991. Lisa, a sex worker, had been found strangled and shot, her body dumped in a river, 3 weeks after she was reported missing. In his confession, Browne said he met Lisa at a blues club in Memphis, Tennessee. He paid for her services, then drove her to an isolated stretch along Interstate 40 near West Memphis. After they were alone, Browne strangled her, shot her several times, and threw her body into the river. The following year, Browne claimed another victim, 39-year-old Timothy Lee Warren. For years, the case had sat cold in Tulsa, Oklahoma. According to police records, in March 1992, a park worker discovered Warren's body near a pond at Mohawk Park. An autopsy revealed 2 gunshot wounds to the head, likely from a .22 caliber revolver. When the body was found, Warren was wearing only pants. His vehicle was later located abandoned near a lake in the area. In his chilling confession, Browne admitted every detail. He claimed he met Timothy at a local diner, lured him to Mohawk Park under the pretense of sex, and executed him before any encounter took place, 2 bullets to the skull. In countless letters and interviews, Browne confessed to a string of murders, including the Browne 1,980 killing of 16-year-old Catherine Jean Heiss. In that case, Browne claimed the two had consensual sex, but after an argument, he strangled her and dumped her body from a bridge into a creek. Browne also admitted to the gruesome murder of 20-year-old Vanda Faye Hodson, the case mentioned earlier. Vanda was found dead in her apartment by her boyfriend, her body savagely stabbed more than 30 times in 1980. But perhaps the most horrifying of Browne's confessions was the murder of 17-year-old Nydia Mendona, whose dismembered remains were discovered in 1984. According to Browne, he met Nydia at Dame's nightclub, a strip club in Houston. After leaving the club together, they went to his hotel room. There, after a brief sexual encounter, Browne strangled her. He then claimed to have butchered her body with a dull butcher's knife he found in the room. Investigators from the town of Colchata, Louisiana, also made their way to the prison to confront Robert Charles Browne about another unsolved case, the mysterious disappearance of Faye Ellen Self. The young woman had never been found, and no solid evidence had ever surfaced to explain her vanishing. During questioning, Robert calmly claimed responsibility for Faye's disappearance. According to his account, They had first met at a nightclub, and after that encounter, he followed her back to her apartment, breaking in quietly later that night. Browne stated that he attacked Faye using a cloth soaked in a mixture of ant poison and chloroform, killing her by suffocation. He claimed to have then transported her body to a nearby river and dumped the remains into the water. But Browne's version of events didn't match the facts known to law enforcement. Faye's car had been found abandoned in the parking lot of the Wagon Wheel restaurant, where she had dined with friends shortly before her disappearance. Despite these contradictions, there was one detail investigators couldn't overlook. Robert Browne had worked as a maintenance man in the very same apartment complex where Faye lived. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, that was also the residence of another victim, Vanda, Faye Hodson. This raised the unsettling possibility that Browne might be responsible for both murders or perhaps was claiming credit for crimes he hadn't committed, for reasons still unclear. Throughout his confessions, Robert often cast moral judgment on his victims, describing many of them as women of low character. He frequently accused them of flirting with him in public despite supposedly being in committed relationships. When pressed about how he planned his murders, Robert claimed that most of his killings were crimes of opportunity, not premeditated acts. He explained that he would meet women in places like motels, nightclubs, and bars, using charm to lure them to isolated locations where he would strike. His methods varied widely. Some victims were strangled, others shot, stabbed, or bludgeoned, with ice picks, screwdrivers, or whatever tools he found nearby. In some cases, Browne pushed his victims from elevated places such as cliffs. Often, he said, he dismembered his victims and left their remains in remote, wildlife-infested areas where nature and animals would erase the evidence. In his statements, Browne claimed responsibility for 17 murders in Louisiana, 9 in persons for Louisiana, Colorado, 7 in Texas, 5 in Arkansas, 3 in Mississippi, 2 in California, 2 in New Mexico, 2 in Oklahoma, and 1 in Washington state. Because he had no personal ties to his victims, Browne explained, he was never seriously questioned in any of these cases, except, of course, for the murder of Heather Dawn Church. In fact, police records showed that, during the initial investigation into Heather's disappearance, officers had visited Browne's residence. At the time, he presented himself as helpful and courteous, but he refused to let them access one particular room of the house, claiming the door was stuck and difficult to open. Investigators noted the behavior as odd, but without clear evidence of a crime, they treated Browne as just another neighbor living an ordinary life. Yet despite the disturbing accuracy of some of Browne's confessions, such as those of Heather Church and Rossi Sperry, many of his other claims raised doubts. Several murders he described included details that matched public newspaper articles, information Browne could have easily accessed in prison. As time passed, some investigators began to suspect that Browne was embellishing his story or outright fabricating portions of it to gain attention, manipulate authorities, or simply feed his own ego. Because many of these later confessions lacked verifiable evidence, law enforcement agencies across several states declined to pursue formal charges. Without concrete proof, the cases remained cold, lost in the shadows of speculation and uncertainty. Still, in the murders discussed earlier in this episode, those of Heather Church, Rossi, Sperry, and others, the evidence against Robert Charles Browne was undeniable. And for those families, at least some measure of justice had finally been served.